Help MythVision keep bringing you material by becoming a Patreon member, as well as PayPal. Like, share, subscribe, and comment. Join the Patreon to get early access to videos and check out the website.
Go ahead, get the book. Come on, subscribe to his podcast.
We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Your host, Eric Lambert. Early Mormonism, Joseph Smith, polygamy, many wives, some teenage. You've got murders, Danites, killing people. There are literal arrests that are trying to be made, extraditing Joseph Smith back to the state where a civil war took place, so to speak, between two militia in 1838. And there were many people who died, including a 9-year-old kid. Okay, lots of crazy hot stuff's going on. You saw their theology, crazy ideas that are floating around, and we just left off on a cliffhanger. Here you have Porter Rockwell being captured by a militia, or not even a militia, actually. I'm sorry. These are contracted men that are seeking this guy, and they find him and they tie him up. And that tells you they had to be badasses, because you look at Porter Rockwell and you got to know he's a badass. So we have David Fitzgerald, author of The Complete Heretic's Guide to Western Religion, The Mormons. This is book number 1. And then we have Bryce Blankenagle, the host of Naked Mormonism podcast. And you guys have to check him out. I have to let you guys say something before we get started. And it's very important that our audience understands how little they even know on what's going on here. So what happened, David? We'll start with you. Because
we are just going from tip top of the iceberg to tip top of the iceberg in this series. I mean, we've been talking about a lot of stuff, but I was just thinking, wow, last episode we passed over a whole chapter, what I wrote in the book. And Bryce, you were saying, how many hours did you spend on the 1843?
Well, what we just discussed, that was like 30 to 40 episodes of my show. And each of those episodes are, from 1 to 3 hours long, right? Like, so there's so much material that we are just abandoning. We don't have time to get into to try and, keep up the pace, to keep this interesting, and to try and keep everybody abreast of this kind of a palpable and, palatable, I should say, timeline. Yeah, we're only kind of scoping the tip of the iceberg from miles off, right? Like we're only barely scratching the surface on all this stuff, because there's so many interplaying mechanisms that are going on, and there's so many other events that are transpiring at the local level and at the nationwide level that are impacting what's going on. And there are just so many vested interests in all of this. There are so many power dynamics to consider. There are so many key figures in this party that we just don't have time to discuss, right? Like Thomas Sharp, I have spent hours on that guy alone on my podcast, because he's such a powerful figure in the crusade against the overreaching powers of the Mormons. And Porter Rockwell, there's so much about Porter Rockwell that we've only just barely scratched the surface of. And Governor Lilburn Boggs, like, he showed up for an episode in the 1838 Mormon War, and now he's just shot, right? Like there's a whole timeline of what happened to him in the interim period as well. So there are so many dynamics to consider in all of this, and there are so many other problems transpiring that are being handled. And, we're just trying to, bash through these, just brute force our way through this timeline in as quick a way as possible to give everybody a very basic rundown of what Mormon history really is. And also, I want to point out, none of this is ever taught in church. None of this is ever taught in seminary. Mormons don't know this stuff. It's a very, 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 very small select group of people who are members of the church who know any of the stuff we're talking about.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, that right there, guys, is where I'm going to jump in and say, and I mean this, you really got to get the book, and you really got to join the podcast. You really have to check them out. If you stuck out this long and you liked what you've heard, you will fall in love with both of these gentlemen's work. And I'm going to make this shout out, because I only have so far of a stretch in connections. If you know how to get a hold of someone in the Netflix field, if you know someone of popularity that might take interest in this type of thing, even Joe Rogan, let's say, and you want to contact him about some of this stuff, feel free to reach out some big names. Let's get these guys catapulted to the next level and make sure that they can get their material out to the world for more people to be aware of this cult. Leah Remini's doing it on Scientology and Jehovah's Witnesses, including people like Lloyd Evans, which I'm going to be interviewing next week on ex-Jehovah's Witness. Here we are doing it with the Mormons. So,
and point of order, I have sent my paper about psychedelics and early Mormonism to Joe Rogan to see if that's something he'd be interested in doing for an episode. No response. So if anyone wants to poke and prod him about that, I think that'd be a topic that he would really, really enjoy talking about. And I would love to teach him about.
Awesome. Well, not Lloyd, but Porter Rockwell gets captured, and that's Joe's man. That's not just Joe's man. That's a childhood friend of Joe's. And he's saying, I need help. Then he comes back because everything seems cool. Like there's no storm. Everything's calm. Or is it? So take us into this, Bryce. I'm excited to see what happens. And I'm sure David knows some of this stuff, but I know David and me, we a lot of times are like, I never heard of this stuff. Even when David starts talking, I'm like, oh, what? But even I see David's face like, what the heck? That's interesting. Let me add that to my info in my mind here, because I never heard of that little key detail and stuff. So
I'm learning stuff through this series for sure. Especially when you study this thing long enough, you get your own takes on how this is playing out, what's going on in like Emma's mind and Joseph's mind. And then Bryce will bring up something and it's like, yes. All of a sudden you see the puzzle pieces click in a different way they hadn't before. And it's exhilarating. Exhilarating.
Yeah. And I want to pick up on what you just said there, David, because this is an important point. And it plays into what I said earlier, that this is the history of Mormonism that Mormons are never taught. But this is the history of Mormonism that the field of Mormon history academia generally agrees upon. There's the overall narrative of early Mormonism and Joseph Smith's life. And most historians, very few will ever disagree with anything within that narrative. We can argue and bicker about various interpretations of certain documents, the context of certain things that are said at certain times. We can argue and discuss and play out with the merits of each of those arguments. And we can play in that field. But what we are telling here on this series is the generally agreed upon narrative of Mormon history. And I can name names of apologists who would not take issue with basically anything we have said. They would take issue with the way that we interpret some of it or the causal link that we have placed on some things, but they would not take issue with any of the facts that we're presenting here. This is the field of Mormon history academia, and that's what my job is. I am a history communicator. I'm not a historian. I don't have a degree, right? I communicate the field of Mormon history to lay audiences. And that's important to note here, that what we're saying here, this is not disagreeable information. Right. This is not information that you're going to find, outside of what, are presented at the John Whitmer Historical Association every year, or at the Mormon History Association, or at the Sunstone Theological Symposium. This is the field of Mormon history academia, and this is a very high level overview of stuff that is in, hundreds of books that have been written over a century and a half. So I wanted to point that out, that this is not anti-Mormon lies that we're talking about. Exactly. This is Mormon history.
Yeah, exactly. And like, as Bryce was saying, nothing we're saying here is controversial in those academic circles. And correct. In fact, I talk about that in the book, the difference between your chapel Mormon and your internet Mormon, who knows all this stuff and interacts with it, even if on an apologetic level, and those who just have no idea any of this stuff exists in the first place.
Which is almost all. 99.9% of Mormons don't know any of this. Yeah. And they probably will never know this, because this is not the Joseph Smith that we sing praise to the man every Sunday. The Joseph Smith that we sing praise to the man, I say that because that's a Mormon hymn, that Joseph Smith is a cardboard cutout. That is a picture. That is a false version. That is a not a real human being. That's just a picture that was painted for us. It's propaganda. That is not the Joseph Smith that people choose to believe is the mouthpiece of God. The Joseph Smith that we're talking about is the human being, the criminal kingpin that was this monster of a human being.
A much more fascinating individual. Yeah.
Yes.
Really.
So what happens?
Let's navigate into this, right? So Porter Rockwell gets arrested by these bounty hunters, and they successfully get him into the state of Missouri. Joe doesn't learn about this until after Porter Rockwell is already in a Missouri prison. Now, they attempt to prosecute Porter Rockwell, and it doesn't go well because the only evidence they have is the affidavit that Lilburn Boggs said that Porter Rockwell shot him. So Lilburn Boggs is sitting in his study. It's dark outside. It's raining. There's a crash through the window and he's unconscious. And then his wife and daughter come running in and screaming. Like, he's not exactly a reliable witness as to who pulled the trigger, right? And then we have the shop owner who said that Porter Rockwell, the guy who was working for that other guy, stole this gun from my shop when he thought that it was some of the slaves actually who had stolen the gun. So the evidence that they have is not really strong. They don't have the fingerprints. They don't have a witness who saw him do it. They don't have hard evidence. So they basically hold a grand jury trial and attempt to prosecute him and say, well, we need time to collect evidence, and then lock him up on bond. And he doesn't have enough money to pay for bail. So Porter Rockwell ends up languishing for, I think it's like 11 months, 12 months in Missouri jails and transferred around different jails, multiple court hearings. Dude tries to break out of prison, but because he's so out of shape, he gets over a fence, and the guy who he tried to help or who helped him break out stumbled over the fence. So Porter Rockwell goes back and drags the guy over the fence. And by the time he goes back and gets the guy, the townsfolk realize that there's been a prison break, and they surround him, and he can't run and get away because he's so out of shape. So he attempts a couple of escapes, and they all fail. But somebody approaches Joseph Smith in all of this. And this is another figure that we need to keep at the forefront of our mind. And this guy is named Joseph H. Jackson. And I'm just going to call him Jackson from now on because there's so many Josephs in all of this, right? So Jackson shows up and he calls himself an adventurer. And Jackson is just another one of these riffraff scoundrels that drifts from town to town and grifts people and does whatever he needs to get by. He's a robber. He's a counterfeiter. He does all sorts of dumb stuff, right? But Joe has the ability to recognize talent, right? And it's from Jackson that we learn about the mothers in Israel that we talked about in the polygamy episode. I read that from Jackson's expose about the women who were great captains. And when Joseph wanted some man's property, he would just tell the women that he was a Missourian and that his property needed to be consecrated, and the great captains would mix in a white powder with his victuals, right? So Joseph Jackson, he shows up on the scene in early 1843, and Joe recognizes that this Jackson guy is useful. He's a great tool and has absolutely no scruples whatsoever. So Jackson claimed that he was working with the sheriffs who tried to arrest Joseph Smith and then, had to leave town because Joe was too powerful. And then when Joe went into hiding, Jackson claims he was working with those sheriffs and told them before he joined the Mormons, hey, I'm going to do whatever I need to get into Joe's inner circle, and then I'm going to help you arrest him. We don't have any evidence from those guys specifically that Jackson was working with them. All we have is Jackson's own words after Joe's death. So take that for what you will. Anyway, so Jackson shows up in Nauvoo, and he's suspected as being a spy. So somebody tries to kill him. And he realizes, oh, I need to not be here. So he spends the winter of 1842 to 43 in Carthage, which is a safe haven. He shows up in early 1843 again and basically just does what's necessary to get on Joe's good graces, to get a meeting with the prophet. And he gets that meeting. So eventually Joe tells Jackson, hey, I'll give you $3,000 if you go to Missouri and break Porter Rockwell out of prison and finish the job and kill Lilburn Boggs, finish the job that Porter Rockwell wasn't able to finish. And Jackson says, okay, cool. So Jackson travels to Missouri. And during this time,
this is so good.
Rockwell was being transferred around various jails. And it was kind of hard to track down exactly where Rockwell was. But Rockwell in Missouri, he was a pariah, right? Because he was one of Joe's boys. He was one of Joe's cronies, and everybody in Missouri hated the Mormons and Joseph Smith. So Porter Rockwell was an absolute pariah. Well, he had attempted to break out. And after that, he spent 11 weeks hobbled. And not just hobbled with chains around his ankles, but with his wrists chained to his ankles. So he spends 11 weeks chained up, hands to feet, and he's so weak he can't do anything. He's just incredibly weak. So Jackson gets to Missouri, and the guy, like, he doesn't actually want to do any of this stuff. He just wants to get on Joe's good graces so that he can expose the prophet. He can write his own expose, just like Bennett had done, and make a shitload of money. So he doesn't actually want to shoot Boggs. He doesn't actually want to break a prisoner out of jail. He doesn't want to become a criminal in Missouri. So what he does is he basically spends a couple of weeks in Missouri, and then he goes back to Nauvoo and tells Joe, oh, sorry, Lilburn Boggs just wasn't home. I couldn't find him. Oh, and Porter Rockwell, the place was too well guarded. I'm sorry. And Joe like stares him down for a minute and is like, I don't believe you. And Jackson was like, well, I mean, I'm staring you down in the eye. Do you like a man that you can stare down? And Joe was like, all right, cool. I'll give you another test. And Joe continues to test Jackson with various things. And Jackson just gets deeper and deeper into Joe's favor here. He doesn't end up, being successful on that mission, but he keeps telling Joe what Joe wants to hear from an adventurer without any scruples like Jackson. And Jackson himself is dreaming of a day that he can lead a platoon of the Nauvoo Legion to, burn and pillage Native American settlements, or, all the way to, out west, or maybe even east to the White House. Who knows what Joe's military campaign is going to look like, but Jackson wants to be there. He's yet another opportunist that sees the Mormons as an opportunity for all kinds of fun shenanigans and to elevate himself.
So many of these guys.
So many. It's birds of a feather, man. That all these same guys just do the same stupid and unscrupulous crap. It's really incredible, right? So Jackson becomes pretty good friends with Joe, and Joe even tries to get Jackson a wife in all of this, or multiple wives, because that's when you show favor and loyalty to the prophet, you are rewarded. That's how criminal empires work, right? But Jackson didn't want to get married to something, or maybe he attempted to kidnap Hiram's daughter and she didn't want to, or maybe Hiram's daughter was, Hiram is Joe's older brother, or maybe Hiram's daughter was actually already promised to another high-ranking member of the church, and Jackson and her were dating, and then, she wanted to go with Jackson, but Jackson couldn't take her out of the city without getting murdered himself. There's a whole bunch of ways to interpret the evidence with Jackson and what happened there. But eventually, Jackson becomes head of one of the Danite companies. And this is extremely helpful because now Jackson is ingratiated deep into the ranks of the high-ranking Mormon leadership while not being really a member. But he's also really useful for counterfeiting. And that's something that we can't just scoot over because it's so important in Nauvoo. counterfeiting there were even well-known different degrees of counterfeit money that fetched different amounts of actual species of actual gold. Because the counterfeiting was so brazen and so blatant that people knew whether the counterfeit was like a good counterfeit or bad counterfeit, and it traded at its own like valuation as money.
That's funny.
There's so much counterfeiting going on, right? and this is a huge problem because, right, like Joe to set up Nauvoo, he was signing any document that somebody would hand him and just extending credit so vastly. And by 1844, the dude was over $1 million in personal debt, which is that's like $40 million today. That dude's massively in debt.
Millions, yes, exactly.
Right. So you still gotta buy supplies. You still gotta run the city, even though everything is being run on credit. And the thing is, the Mormons themselves are really industrious people. They are making goods. They are working. They are constantly building. They're constantly doing construction projects of various proportions and purposes. But they can't manufacture stuff at a price that is going to make it cheaper than the competition, because this is industrial America. Right, like America is in the earliest phases of industrializing, and Chicago is beginning its industrial transformation. The industrial America is moving further and further west, which is making commodities everywhere on the frontier where the Mormons were settled cheaper. So the Mormons can't manufacture pottery and tack and leather goods and all these commodities at a price that's any cheaper than people can buy from elsewhere. So they're not making enough money. And Nauvoo doesn't have enough time to mature factories and manufacturing districts to utilize its place on the Mississippi to ship goods up and down the Mississippi at high river. So they have great opportunities. They just don't have the capacity to realize that economic potential. It's all just potential. It's not real economic power yet, because it's all on credit, right? So the way that the Mormons are getting by is credit from the prophet, and the various markets are buying and selling goods through bartering and exchange goods and exchange commodities, and then through companies like the Nauvoo House, right? And we remember the Nauvoo House was to be Joe's premier hotel that he created and commanded in the name of God for people to purchase stock in the Nauvoo House, right? So there are these various operations and organizations that Joe is selling stock of that don't have any capital. He's just saying that this company is worth $3 million. And then people are buying stock to fill out the $3 million. But their stock oftentimes is purchased in land deeds. They're giving land deeds that they purchased to purchase stock options in the Nauvoo House. Or they're like, if Joe owes somebody, a note, an IOU, and they come in and confront him while he's tending at his red brick store, he'll give him a couple barrels of grain and say, here, my debt is paid, and not mark that on anything and not have the money to replace the inventory. So the Mormons are operating with this vast and complicated system of bartering and exchanging and counterfeit money and credit and IOUs and land deeds. And it's just a vast, complicated economic empire. And it's all like, when you boil it all down to it, it's all, what will you give me for what's in this paper bag? Right? It's like, well, what's in the paper bag? It doesn't matter what's in the paper bag. What will you give me for it? There's nothing underpinning. There's no real economics underpinning Nauvoo's economy. It's all just built as a house of cards. It's all very fragile. And it's all built on Joe's name, right? Because he was the one signing all of the land deeds to settle it.
And let's not forget, for the rank and file Mormonism, you're basically living in a communist system where the money's not even in landing it. They're just doing the work to make it happen because the prophet told them to.
And what made this even harder, of course, also was the Nauvoo Municipal Court, because somebody would come into Nauvoo, a non-Mormon would come into Nauvoo, they would sell goods, and they would get IOUs, they would get notes worth X amount of dollars, or they would get counterfeit money. And then that money wouldn't be paid, the IOU wouldn't be paid, or they would discover that the money was counterfeit, and they would go to Nauvoo and file a criminal complaint against the person for theft or for, counterfeit or for whatever. And everybody would be brought into the Nauvoo Municipal Court. And if they were Joe's buddy, he'd let him go. He'd let him go because he's a criminal kingpin. Right. So that is causing the non-Mormons around the Mormons to bristle a lot, because they're losing a lot of money trying to sell goods to these Mormons. Also, the Mormons are voting any way that Joe tells them to, right? So they're gaining a ton of political power, which is becoming very dangerous. They're getting their own people elected to county level offices, which is making the non-Mormons not really happy, because the Mormons who get elected, they're not listening to anybody but Joseph Smith in their official capacity, right? So he's gaining political power on top of all of this wealth, right? And also to tap into something that we discussed quite a few episodes ago, right? The nationwide, a lot of powerful Masons are really mad at Joseph Smith because he created the Nauvoo Lodge almost a sort of under false pretenses, because the Illinois lodges
sort of, you say?
Well, sort of, right, because the Illinois lodges never gave them permission to start a lodge, but this guy came into Nauvoo who was a master Mason and had the authority to grant them the power to charter a lodge. He came into Nauvoo, Joe showed him a good weekend, and the guy ascended Joseph and Sidney Rigdon and Brigham Young to master Mason at sight, and then they founded a lodge in Nauvoo. And then they're initiating all of the Mormon brethren into the rites, and basically the Nauvoo Lodge became larger than all of the lodges across the entire state of Illinois. So you're concentrating political power, you're concentrating money, you're concentrating a lot of political interest from politicians who are trying to get the Mormon voting bloc, and you're concentrating the power of Master Masons in this one little criminal empire. And that's causing a lot of people to really not like the Mormons. Yeah.
So we got 30 minutes, right? And
oh God. Wow.
And just to give, like, that was like a perfect example of how Bryce takes his episodes and can really rabbit trail into one of those 20 points he just brought up that are like, holy crap, there's so much there that have their own story, have their own birth, life, death narrative, if you will, of what happened.
You don't know how much I'm biting my tongue saying, oh, let's not go down that rabbit hole. Oh, no, let's stay on.
Dude, I'm still wondering, and this is just me in my mind. I'm like, but Porter Rockwell, you know what I mean? Like, but what about the poor dude for 11 weeks who's shackled? And we just went into this deep, vast, complex system. And I almost jumped in and said, not only are there like IOUs and papers, but like, I wonder how many verbal contracts. He just said, hey, yeah, I'll get you back. And then the guy comes back, and it's like, who knows what's been going on? It's crazy. But maybe is that even part of the story, Porter Rockwell here at this point? Or I mean,
I just want to point out that Mormon on Mormon fraud crime is still a thing, and it's going on just as strong now as it was then. So
confidence fraud. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That guy can't be running an MLM. He's the bishop. He's a great guy.
Exactly. That was one of those things that when I started researching my Mormon book, didn't have any idea about. Just said, oh, you know what? I should touch on this thing here. And all of a sudden, there's a whole chapter of the book right there. It's like, wow. Yeah.
It's bad. It's scary to understand the way that Mormons act and the way Mormon culture is today. It was all birthed here in Nauvoo, right? Like that's where all of this comes from. And the persecution narrative was birthed in Missouri, in the Missouri Mormon War, really. It's weird to see modern day culture, the foundations of it, really a lot of it rests in Nauvoo and has survived. It has been retained, and certain aspects have been emphasized in the modern culture today. So with all that said, right? So Porter Rockwell's in prison. Joe wants Jackson to go break him out, and he's not. Jackson isn't successful. But Joe is for a brief time here in early 1843. There's a very brief era of good feelings in the church, and Joe decides to go a little too far. So he's acquiring a ton of wives. In 1843 alone, I think he gets 10 or 11 new wives in just the first half of 1843. And this is like, he's expanding it as well, because this is also the time when Willard Richards and Brigham Young and Hiram Smith, Joe's older brother, and William Clayton and a bunch of other high-ranking leadership are also beginning to take second, third, and fourth wives.
Right. Oh, and at the same time, they're denying that this is happening. People talk about it. They're not really fooling anybody, but publicly in print and in sermons, they're saying, oh, no, there's no such thing as polygamy.
Exactly.
All the time. Yeah, it's like we said last episode, it's a secret civil war amongst the leadership of the church, because half of them are in on it and half of them are like, whoa, no.
And it's all in code words too, right? All of it is in code words. I gotta find this passage, right? So there is a book that was recently written and published. It's called Writing Mormon History, and basically what it is an anthology of some of the largest names in Mormon history over the past 4 decades. They basically all got together and wrote about writing their books about all of this, right? So I have to find this. I have to find this because the chapter where Linda King Newell talks about writing Emma's biography is fascinating. It is fascinating because Emma's biography, it's titled Mormon Enigma. It was written in the late 1970s into the early 1980s at a time when there were very, very few women in Mormon studies, and women's voices were not really paid attention to in Mormon studies. And the entire church history department was all run by men. Everything. It was all men. Largely is still the case today. It's a little bit better now than it was back in the 80s. But so Linda King Newell talks all about writing this, and she discusses the troubles with polygamy. Okay. It took me a second to find the passage. I'm sorry. But so Linda talks about when she was beginning to learn about polygamy. And she went into the church historian's office, Ron Esplin, and confronted him about this because she was finding all of these original documents that have to do with polygamy, but none of them ever say using code words. The Mormons were using code words, right? So she says, one day I remember marching into Ron Esplin's office and blurting out, everybody is lying about polygamy. Joseph and other church leaders are lying. Emma is lying. Ron looked at me calmly and said, you don't know about the code words, do you? Then he explained that church leaders were answering the public accusations of polygamy with denials of polygamy in the Asiatic sense, or spiritual wives, but they privately called it the new and everlasting covenant, celestial marriage, or a man's privilege, end quote. So she's writing this biography about Emma, trying to confront polygamy from an academic and a defensible position. And she's reading, like, they're talking about celestial marriage, but then in the public circulars, they're like, no, men can only have one wife. We're a strictly monogamous sect. But she's seeing these code words about celestial marriage and the new and everlasting covenant, a man's privilege, reading these documents. And she marches into the office and is like, they're all lying. And he just kind of writes it off like, you don't know about the code words. Oh, you're so cute. You're so funny. You don't know about the code words. And that's how they were able to get away with all of this in the 1840s, because they were using code words. This is well known among historians today. That was well known among only church historians in the 1980s. But it's well known today because of the work that historians have done to access and decode those code words. So when we find in like the book of the law of the Lord, where it lists two people's names and it writes WAS next to their names, that means wedded and sealed. You don't know what that means unless you know the code words. You got to know what they're actually saying when they say one thing, especially when you know for a fact that it's a lie or it's a deliberately calculated sentence that is calculated to delude somebody.
So these Mormon historians, I have to ask, just for audience, this woman finds out they're lying, and their response is, well, they're not really lying. You just don't know that they've been talking about it the whole time. And really, it's just these code words, and it's not a bad thing. You make it sound like it's a bad thing. No. They were doing this for a while, and this is normal. This was God's.
Honestly, so much stuff came out in the 80s about Mormon history that I'm surprised there's still a Mormon church after that. You know, if you didn't look at what the Catholic Church has been doing the last 20 years, it just blew my mind. It's like, how did they survive this? All the revelations popped out.
It's also interesting as a case study for what it actually was like in Nauvoo, as much as it is today, right? Because like publicly speaking, the church was a monogamous sect, right? And one of Joe's boys named Phelps. Phelps was Joe's ghostwriter for a lot of things. Phelps wrote this pamphlet called "A Voice of Innocence from Nauvoo" and presented it to the Relief Society. And it basically said, we're a monogamous sect. How dare you people accuse us of polygamy? That's degrading to our women. And the women of the Relief Society, like 1,000 people signed this thing, right? 1,000 of the Nauvoo women. There's a lot of code words within that circular in and of itself. When people today are learning about the code words of polygamy, it's not dissimilar from how prospective wives learned about polygamy in Nauvoo, right? Because you're a girl, a woman, of whatever age. You hear about all of the rumors, but then you see at the pulpit, Joseph Smith is decrying these accusations, this fake news that we are practicing polygamy, and you hear that every Sunday. But then, you hear the whispers, you hear the rumors, you hear what's going on in Relief Society, and then suddenly William Clayton or Willard Richards takes a liking to you and sets up a meeting, and he talks to you about the new and everlasting covenant and teaches you the biblical principles that justify polygamy. And suddenly it's like, wait, but what Joseph said last time, a sect, and he says, no, well, this isn't polygamy. This is celestial marriage. We have always said that celestial marriage is the new and everlasting covenant. This is not polygamy. This is a sealing.
Yes.
I find it interesting they use that language, the new and everlasting covenant. I think that's funny because wow, did they reinterpret the new covenant? They apply it in a celestial. They apply it into an actual marriage to a male and a female instead of this strange, ambiguous, what seems to be spiritual, maybe literal, but that Jesus would marry his bride, the church. I mean, they took this and reworked it to their own little Sally Sue looks good over there. Let me have a new everlasting covenant with her, if you will. That's really crazy.
They are taking the truth and pritzling it up like balloon animals. It just kills me to see the convoluted routes they take.
Well, that's what's cool about the Bible. You can make it say whatever you want.
Right. It's a ventriloquist dummy for most. As Dr. Price says, we got 20 minutes, Bryce. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do with 20 minutes left?
I know, right?
Okay. Okay. So I guess let's come back to a few more big names into all of this, right? So John C. Bennett, right? He defects in 1842. It's a huge meltdown. But he also, the dude wore a lot of hats, and all of his roles had to be filled by various people. But Bennett was actually also a trial for a lot of people, because Joe could tell whose side they were on based on how they talked about John Bennett. And John Bennett had some really close friends in Nauvoo that Joe suspected of mutiny after Bennett left. And Sidney Rigdon is one of those. Sidney Rigdon, Nancy, Joe proposing to Nancy, that was a big problem in their relationship. But that also happened when Bennett left and he published in the Sangamo Journal the happiness letter that Joe wrote to Nancy about, happiness under or what is wrong under one circumstance may be right in the sight of the Lord, right? And that put Joe and Rigdon's relationship into the grinder. So Bennett had a lot of friends in Nauvoo, and Joe suspected all of them of mutiny. Add into this, Sidney Rigdon was also the postmaster of Nauvoo, which was the only government contract in Nauvoo, basically, that would bring in steady money. And Joe wanted that job because it was steady money. So Joe accused Sidney Rigdon of stealing his letters and withholding letters and burning his letters and stuff like that, which was just an excuse that Joe was using when people were saying, hey, I sent you a letter 2 weeks ago that you owe me $500. And Joe's like, oh, well, Rigdon must have, burned the letter or whatever, right? So there's a lot of power dynamics going on. And Rigdon is one of these figures who was good friends with John Bennett. And when John Bennett leaves, that draws a line in the sand for Joe with a lot of these guys. And that basically creates within the Mormon leadership factions. And in one of these factions, we have the anti-polygamists, and in the other faction, we have the pro-polygamists. Joe, of course, sided with the pro-polygamists. The anti-polygamists became to be Joe's greatest enemies. So on the pro-polygamist side, we got Joseph Smith at the head of it, but we also got Brigham Young. And we got Brigham Young's cousin, Willard Richards, who was Joe's scribe. We got William Clayton. We got a bunch of guys within that mix who are all polygamists or who are all hoping to be polygamists or who were initiated and were totally into it, right? On the anti-polygamist side, we have Sidney Rigdon. And Sidney Rigdon was basically being pushed out of the church by Joseph Smith at this time because Joe knew that Rigdon would never go for polygamy, especially with the whole Nancy affair going on. Rigdon was not into it. But Rigdon was joined by people like William Marks and William and Jane Law and the Higbee brothers and the Foster brothers. So various people were in this anti-polygamy faction in leadership positions of the church. Now, a few of these names to keep in mind are three sets of brothers. We have the Law brothers, the Higbee brothers, and the Foster brothers. And these guys are important because they end up publishing the Nauvoo Expositor, which leads to Joe's death. But these guys are in the anti-polygamy cabal. Now, the Law brothers, this is William and Wilson Law. William Law was co-president of the church. He had replaced Thomas B. Marsh. Thomas B. Marsh was one of the guys who defected with Samson of Ard in the 1838 Mormon War and turned state's witness. So he was replaced by William Law. And William and Jane Law were really good friends with Joe and Emma until Joe wanted Jane. And Emma probably wanted William, right? So these are the Laws. William and Jane Law were also basically the guardians of Sarah and Maria Lawrence, who were, two sisters that had been taken to wife by Joseph Smith, right? So the Laws saw what was going on. They knew what was going on. They knew that there were code words. They knew that polygamy was going on. And then Joe proposes to Jane, and then Emma maybe proposes to William, or there's something going on here. We're not sure exactly what. But the Laws are kind of the figureheads of this anti-polygamy Mormon movement. And they're also good friends with the Higbee brothers and the Foster brothers. So it's the Laws, the Higbees, and the Fosters. Those are the three families that we need to remember going into the rest of 1843 and into 1844. They're going to figure heavily into the end of Joseph Smith's life. So that's the anti-polygamy Mormon movement. But then we also have the pro-polygamy Mormon movement with Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and Willard Richards and Newell Whitney and Heber C. Kimball and a bunch of these other names that are considered Mormon royalty by the Utah Church, because they are the ones who went out to Mexico and founded the Nation of Deseret, their own theocracy, their polygamous theocracy. So within all of this, Porter Rockwell's in jail. He's languishing in jail. There was the ever-present question of the new governor, Governor Thomas Ford, is he going to honor the arrest warrants and extradition warrants that were signed by Governor Carlin the previous year? Is he going to honor those and get Joseph Smith extradited to Missouri out of his state in compliance with the request from the governor of Missouri, Governor Reynolds? And this was a big question. This was a question that was being flung around quite a lot. And Thomas Ford was elected as the Democrat governor of Illinois thanks to the Mormons. Joe flipped his vote last minute in favor of Thomas Ford because the Whig candidate couldn't give the Mormons everything they wanted. So they got the Democrat hired to the job. That's Thomas Ford. So Thomas Ford is trying to balance the interests of the state and its laws with the interests of keeping the Mormons on his side. But, trying to retain that while honoring your predecessor's extradition warrant for their supreme leader, it's kind of a problem. So what do you do?
Politics.
Politics. Whatever will we do? The best laid plans of mice and men. Well, Governor Ford gives the sheriffs who tried to arrest Joe back in 1842 permission to arrest him. But they knew that they had to arrest him when he wasn't in Nauvoo, or else it would go down just like it did last time, and they would be chased out of the city, and Joe and Rockwell would be released. But of course, Rockwell was in Missouri. They were close to having their guy. Missouri, the state of Missouri, was close to having their two guys as the figureheads of this militia, this treasonous movement. They were really close to it. They just needed to get Joe there to prosecute him for Lilburn Boggs and for all the Missouri charges. He needed to step foot in the state of Missouri. As soon as Joe was in Missouri, he was dead to rights. Everybody knew this. Nobody knew this more than Joseph Smith. The very last thing he ever wanted to do was step foot in the state of Missouri, because as soon as he did, his head was gone. He was dead. That was it. That was it. So Joe knew that if he's arrested, he's running in danger zone. And all of his boys know this as well. The Danites know this as well. The Nauvoo Legion, who were all undyingly loyal to the prophet, know this as well. So the sheriffs work with somebody. I don't know who. I don't think anybody knows who, but the sheriffs work with somebody to find out when Joseph Smith is going to be out of Nauvoo. And they're waiting until he's out of Nauvoo, so he'll be vulnerable and he won't be surrounded by his boys.
And no habeas corpus bullshit.
That's right. That's exactly right. They have to keep him out of Nauvoo. And that's the thing is, they not only have to get him arrested, they have to get him across the state line into Missouri without going anywhere near a single Mormon settlement. And the Mormon settlements aren't just Nauvoo. There are smaller satellite Mormon settlements all around Nauvoo, north, southeast, and even west across the Mississippi in the Iowa Territory. There's a whole bunch of Mormon settlements out there too. Nauvoo is the stronghold. They need to get Joe across the state to Missouri without passing through any of those and not falling vulnerable to, being ridden up on while they're just on one of the main roads. So they have to take back roads if they get him arrested. So
bounty hunting is a very complicated profession.
I don't know that reference, but it was perfect.
It's from The Mandalorian.
Okay, well, that's why. All right. Fair enough. Okay, so I'm going to pull up a map just so we can visualize what this actually looks like, right? So I'm going to share my screen here. My apologies. Okay, here we go. Right, so here is Dixon, Illinois, right? And it's just about an hour and a half out of Chicago, right? So Nauvoo is all the way down here, right? This is about 3 to 4 days journey on horseback right here. To get all the way through these, or if you take the steamer over to, or if you, ride a horse out to Clinton, you can take a steamer all the way down the Mississippi, and that'll get you all the way down to St. Louis or down to Nauvoo or wherever you need to be, right? So that's the general geography of this area. Here is Dixon. Well, Emma happens to have some family living up in Dixon, and the Smiths decide to go on a little vacation, a little family gets together, family reunion. And this happens in late June of 1843. So the entire thing they want to do, the constables want to do, is get Joe into Missouri. If they can get him down here to, like, let's say Warsaw maybe, and cross the river, they're in Missouri. They win. That's all they got to do. But Nauvoo is right here, and there are Mormon settlements all over here, right? And here are the twin cities of anti-Mormonism, Warsaw and Carthage, right? The Warsaw Signal with Thomas Sharp is published out of here, right on the Mississippi. Here's Carthage, which is the county seat of Hancock County, which is the county in which Nauvoo resides, right? Here's Nauvoo, but this whole area is populated with Mormon settlements. So the constable's plan is to arrest Joseph Smith in Dixon, take back roads, probably through Peoria, maybe down the Illinois River, and get him somewhere around here, maybe in Quincy or maybe up here in Warsaw, somewhere along here, get him over the state line into Missouri. If they can do that, they win. They complied with their arrest orders. They complied with the extradition orders from both of the governors of Illinois and of Missouri. They have filled out all the things that they need to do to comply with the law, and they get him into the custody of Missouri state constables, who can then convey him to Richmond or to wherever they need to hear the criminal charges against Joseph Smith, and send him to the gallows, right? He committed treason and murder and arson and robbery, larceny. The guy deserved the gallows. That's where he was headed.
It's a fair cop. Yeah.
It is. Yeah. So these constables, working with somebody, I don't know who, they found out that Joe would be up in Dixon, Illinois, and they follow him without Joe's knowledge. They follow him all the way up to Dixon, Illinois. It's a journey, like I said, of like 3-4 days on horseback. They follow him all the way out there. A couple of his boys with him.
Joe has a couple of his boys with him, you said?
Yeah, so Joe has a couple of his boys. William Clayton is one of them, his scribe. William Clayton is doing all of the letter writing, and keeping Joe's journal every day. William Clayton is super useful to him. And Stephen Markham, who is a member of the Nauvoo Legion, of course, a Danite, and also a really powerful figure in all of this, as well as an executor of Joseph Smith's financial affairs as well. So Joe has a couple of his boys, but he doesn't have a posse. He doesn't have his bodyguards. He doesn't have a bunch of Danites around him to guard him. So these constables are in Dixon when Joe is there, and they're tracking him. They're trying to find where in Dixon he is. And they see Stephen Markham, one of Joe's boys, that they know his face. They see him walking down the streets, and they basically trail him back to Joe, where Joe is hiding out in Dixon. And they knock on the door, and Emma answers, and they barge into the house and arrest Joseph Smith at gunpoint.
Boom.
And there's this heroic story that he opens up his chest and says, "Well, shoot then." And they didn't have the heart to shoot him, but they arrest him. And Joe knows that he's in he's Poop Creek right here, because he's nowhere near his boys. He doesn't have a posse, and all of his boys are, who knows, that they're in Nauvoo, or they're in, some of the satellite settlements, Mormon settlements. He's got two constables with guns pointed at him, and he's arrested, and he yells out to Stephen Markham, "Get to Nauvoo and tell him where I am." But the problem is Stephen Markham immediately departs. He immediately leaves Dixon to head to Nauvoo to alert the Legion and the Danites that Joe has been captured. But none of them know what route the constables are taking him back to Missouri through. So this sets into sequence a chain of events that will outlive the prophet himself.
Oh my gosh. David, did he freeze on us for a second?
It looks like it. Yeah.
David, what do you think, man? What do you think of this?
He's had 9 lives, and one by one, they're all getting snapped up. And we'll see how many he's got in the pull out bag of tricks.
Oh my gosh, man. This really needs to be in a like non-Mormon biased show where it shows a human for being a human. Like, you know, they did a great job of portraying on Tombstone Kurt Russell going in as Wyatt Earp and all. And they were in there hitting people over the head with opening poker shops and gambling and taking advantage of the people in the local town. But they show that. And they also show the heroic part of what he brought to the table in some sense, because there was they had the red bandanas. I don't know if they were the Cowboys, whatever they were, but you know, they were facing another clan, another group, another posse, and they show the good, the bad, the ugly to some degree. Of course, you still think he's the good guy, but they could paint Joseph Smith from the histories as somewhat of a bad guy, but you'll get so I guess sucked into the insulation of the Mormon idea that I don't know if you've ever done this, but if you watch a bad guy show, or you know he's not good by the standards that we hold as true, yet you just don't want to see bad things happen to him. Like, that's how this sounds to me. You know what I mean?
It's like The Godfather. It's like Game of Thrones.
I just lost you again, David. Wait till he comes back.
Back it up.
Today.
That's got to be David's internet. You and I are fine. I mean, you and I can see each other.
But they were
back up, man. Start
over.
Where did you lose me?
The very beginning. When
Game of Thrones.
Yep.
Okay. It's like The Godfather. It's like Game of Thrones. You've got all these people larger than life doing horrible things, and yet there are people, there are ancestors doing these things, you know? So, I mean, say what you want about Porter Rockwell, about Joseph Smith. They were brave. They were amazingly lucky. They were amazingly resourceful. You know, there are all these things. So there's so much you can look at and spin into a positive way. If you just ignore the fact that, they're murdering people and they're doing a criminal empire and want to take over the government and turn into a theocracy. But you gotta love them.
Yeah, it's amazing how you say that. Like The Sopranos. I love The Sopranos. Okay. Absolutely horrible guy. Great. Trying to be the best dad he knows how to be. He's an imperfect husband. He's killing people. He's like no empathy or
that's what he does.
That's because you're in their story. You relate. You're like, all right, I'm picturing. It's like they painted him so well that you are them. So
exactly. It's like Reservoir Dogs. You're rooting for them. It's like, oh yeah, I hope they catch that rat who's a cop. He was a good guy who's working for us, you know?
Yeah. Like part of me's like, Joe deserves it. But the other part of me is like, yo, is he going to get Porter Rockwell out of prison?
Yeah, exactly.
Part of me is like, Porter Rockwell needs to get out of prison, bro. I want to see what happens. Like, and then Joe does something to escape it. Like, I don't know. That's how this has turned out. So for me, this has become an actual like real story for me, to a point where it's like, damn, like I want the guy to get what he deserves. But it's amazing. Some of these guys that you think the whole world around that they've done wrong is what's going to happen. No, it's the people closest to him.
Yeah, that's the thing. There's such a universe of things going on in this tiny little part of Illinois, you know?
And I want to...
Nations. Yeah.
I want to make a bigger point about that too, because like we opened up this conversation by talking about how Mormons don't know any of this. I mean, like 99.9% of Mormons will never know any of this. They will never learn any of this because they believe in a cardboard cutout prophet. That's not real. It's not a real human being. Nobody is that. What Joseph Smith is larger than life. He truly is one of those enigmatic figures in history that we can look at and be like, how did he live for so long? How is it possible that he was able to accomplish what he did? How was he so unscrupulous? How was he able to do all of these things? And then people still fawn over him and worship the ground on which he walks because he's that charismatic individual. And the thing is, it grossly infantilizes an entire population of millions of people who sing praise to the man every Sunday, singing praise to this guy. when I know, like, the majority of my colleagues in the field of Mormon history believe in the church. They have a testimony that this is the true church. It's far more nuanced and far more complicated than the chapel attending Mormon. But that in of itself proves that people can know this information and still believe this guy to be a prophet of God. And it grossly infantilizes the Mormons who go to church every Sunday and, bear their testimony that Joseph Smith was the prophet of God, when they don't know the real story. They don't know what's really here. And there are things that happen in Joseph Smith's life that teach us lessons far beyond anything that the gospel, which is to say, euphemistic for Mormonism, can teach us. There are human tendencies. There are aspects of human psychology that his story teach us that we can't escape, that make him so appealing, but teach us lessons that are far transcendent beyond any religion.
And so applicable to right now, to the moments we're living in these days.
Thank you.
Year 2020. Yeah.
Exactly. And how dangerous cult of personality and charismatic populist leaders can truly be. Yeah. And, God, yeah.
And lest you think we're just picking on the Mormons, this is true about every single religion out there, no matter how gentle and benign it looks like to us. They all started from a very different place. At least I can say it for all of Western religion, and probably a big chunk of Eastern religion as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ladies and gentlemen, what's going to happen to the prophet? What's going to happen to God's right-hand man? You guys are going to have to check out the next episode, because I cannot wait to see what's going to happen. Let me know what you think of this story so far. Let me know what you guys think of the series, for sure. Bryce?
I just want to also point out, Derek, you shared with us a question that somebody sent in. Let's do a whole Q&A episode. So if y'all have questions, pop them in the comments below. If you want us to expound on any of the points that you feel like we kind of slided over, or if there's something that, question that's come up that you feel, based on what we presented, put it in the comments section. We would love to do a motherload Q&A kind of live stream and, try and dig into what all of you are thinking about this series, because we read, I don't know, I read the comments. I'm that vain, and I recognize it, and I'm absolutely loving what I'm seeing in the comments. I'd also love to see questions in there as well, because I mean the rabbit holes that we are ignoring and we're passing by. We're skimming on the mountaintops. We're not getting into the valleys. If people want us to explore some valleys, hey, let us know. Put it in the comments, and we'll compile all of those questions and do our best to answer those as well.
Definitely. And if you guys want, you can email me your questions, mythvisionpodcast@gmail.com. Go down into the description, guys. Become Patreon members, become patrons, if you will, of these two gentlemen, and get the book, check out the podcast, show them that you have interest because you guys really like the series and what's going on, and you want to get an in-depth of what's happening. Both of them go more exhaustive than this show can and touch on things you didn't hear. So make sure you guys check it out. I can't wait to see if Joseph Smith slips out again, or if he gets nailed to a stake. And who knows, we got to see what happens next. So do not miss that. And that's all I've got today, ladies and gentlemen. I'm super stoked for the story and how it's turned out so far. I can't wait to what happens next. So this is why I always say not to forget. We are MythVision.